And then I'll beg again for note takers. John, I thought your solicitation would have better results, but unfortunately not. So we really do need somebody to take notes. I don't expect, although I could be naive, a lot of controversy or a lot of notes to be taken, but I could be wrong. Really can't move forward without somebody.
Sparks, I can't. I have another meeting scheduled that I'll be stepping out to deal with during the middle where I would volunteer. So we don't need a blow by blow. We've got a recording that takes care of that. We just need somebody to capture the major action items. So this isn't hard. If you've never done it before, it's a great way to, make sure that you got a really good handle on what the conversation is as it's going along. So I'm going to do our chairs up here a favor, and I'm going to volunteer somebody that I don't know. So those of you that I know are safe. So if you don't know me well, you should feel worried. If you do know me and you want to save some poor person from, having to say no to me when I point them out, please volunteer now. Just action items. That's all we're looking for. All right, I said I'd do it. So, do you have a device that you can take notes on? So, having never done it is okay. All we need is we decided we would do this. Okay, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We have a Jefferson.
Yes.
No, I'll Jefferson.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, so this is, as I said, the Modern Working Group. The required note well. Please do note it. It is important. You see it every meeting. It just goes over your head, but it is important to understand the IPR rules that we're operating under here. So you're in this meeting, so you're agreeing to conform to the note well. The agenda, we'll do some agenda bashing here. John will be talking about modern problems, and we will be trying really hard to move beyond the modern problems draft and onto other working group items. Tom will talk about NNP that he talked about during the interim meeting a little bit as a motivating example use case. Chris will talk about about DRIP and path forward on that, and we'll spend some time talking work plan next steps. I don't expect us to require the full 2 hours, but who knows?
You might want to get a little closer to the mic.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. So without further ado, John.
Dan York, I'll be jabber-scribing. Just while John's coming up to the front, I'll just mention that Henning is joined in remotely from the Tampa airport, so he is here listening too.
Great, thanks, Henning.
Dr. Schultz, Renee, we miss you. Okay. Hi, I'm John. I am going to be talking about our problem statement. Next slide. But it's really not just like a problem statement. This is one of these kind of grab bags of there's some problem things expressed in it. There's a framework that tries to explain the ontology that we see behind modern, what the actors are, what the data elements are that we think are associated with it. And then it goes through and enumerates a bunch of use cases related to the three major protocols that we aspire to develop here. Those are for acquisition, management, and retrieval. The basic notion here, of course, is that we want to create an information model that is going to talk about kind of what information you need to have about telephone numbers on the internet. And the three acquisition, management, and retrieval mechanisms are merely going to be operating on that common information model. This has kind of been the cell of this that takes us beyond enum and, kind of the early thinking we had where, geez, we just need some kind of like a flat file that's going to map telephone numbers to like SIP URIs and we'll be done. And this seemed like a really great idea in 1999. What we actually discovered is we really need an entire ecosystem that's going to explain how these numbers are created, how they get provisioned, how they get managed. Then you worry about how they get retrieved, and having a common information model for all that seemed essential. That's how we ended up here. That is what this problem statement concerns. Next slide. So, things have not been proceeding super expeditiously or smoothly in this working group. There's been a great deal of controversy, let's be blunt, about its scope. There's been, I think, a great deal of resistance to some of the ideas that have been expressed here. I don't want to sweep that under the rug. Our chairs wisely decided that we should have some kind of an interim meeting where we got together and pushed hard on this. And today I'm going to push quite hard because I think what we've got now is pretty good. We've been trying to have a working group item that describes the problem here for some time now. And I think I'm one of many people who is frustrated with our inability to converge on something that seems adequate to be a starting point to go forward to do the work that has been chartered here. So friendly John, for those of you who are just in stir, is not going to be at the microphone today. You're going to see slightly less friendly John as I go through and describe what it is we're doing, where we are with the model, and why I am just incensed that we have been unable to adopt a working group item and go forward on this. So what did we do? We had this interim and it actually was quite productive. I think we did surface some of the issues that really were getting people caught up, especially on the acquisition protocol and the way that we had cast that. So I think the good news is that we made some tweaks to the model, and hopefully these tweaks will alleviate some of the concerns that have been expressed about the model in the past. One of the main ones is that we added in the concept of a registrar. Previously, we'd had registries, we'd had communication service providers and users, but we hadn't really had something analogous to the registrar of the domain name business in this. And as we discussed this at our interim call, I think it became clear that that would be a very useful role to describe within this architecture. And actually, when you see some of my charts in this, you'll see it actually fits in quite well and clarifies a lot of things for me about how the allocation model works and about how thin the registry at the top of this can really be. We also changed a lot of the end user specific text. Okay, we had some kind of forward-looking, left-wing, wouldn't it be great if consumers could, own their own telephone numbers and stuff? And Henning actually very wisely pointed out to us that rather than dying on that hill, perhaps what we should do instead is take something that is very widely and practically used in the telephone network today, which is free phone assignments, which operate in precisely this registrar, registry, registrant model, where you go out and you can procure from effectively a registrar, if you're a REST-board, right, a free phone number, and then shop it to service providers at various competitive rates to ascertain who is going to propagate that for you. And really all of the use cases we can show for this are now practical real-world use cases. And that is one of the major revisions you'll find to the problem statement today, is that we did that. We also decided to kind of let drip be drip. That is, so we have a mandate within this working group as well to explore alternatives to centralized monolithic registries. Rather than really detailing that, we kind of had like some use cases for it, but it was not deep enough to be useful. And obviously we needed more context, I think, for people to really understand what those distributed registries would look like. So what we've done instead is we have definitions and things like that. We make sure people understand distributed registries are something in our scope within the problem statement, but we have left that to other specifications to fill in more detail. And I went through all the use cases and I tried to fix them to conform to this stuff. And hopefully I was relatively successful. I'm not here to tell you the document is done. Right? I'm not here to say this is ready for working class call. I think I'm ready to say, though, that if we don't think this is like the basic idea and that this is a good start for us to go forward with, we need to take a really serious look at what we think we're doing here and whether this is a waste of our time. Next slide. So this is very similar to the slide that I showed at the interim that enumerated the roles of the various actors in this ontology. The little one that is in green there for the registrar is the new one. Previously, and it's true, there was something I think I was conflating as I was thinking about this, because I was like, there are registries for distributing numbers, and then there are CSPs, and then there are delegates, and I think we needed to get to a point where we could say the registry is going to be responsible for the core number allocation functions. Is this TN assigned or not? Kind of stuff. Maybe have a pointer to the serving CSP. if we want the registry to be slightly thicker than that. But it's really this concept that there is a registrar as a logical role that has relationships with CSPs and users, business relationships, knows who they are, has their contact info. If law enforcement people, for whatever reason, need to happen to know who has been assigned that number, that is where that would reside logically within the registry. Next slide. The interesting thing about the picture I tell about this now, and there's actually a picture like this in the draft. I busted out email effects for the first time in a few years and put together some ASCII art to go into the draft for this. I think when you lay things out this way, you see that the CSP and registrar functions very commonly should be performed by the same administrative entity. And if you look at the way most of the telephone network works today, I think it looks in a model quite like this. There are authorities that either are identical to the registries or contract with the registry that does this on their behalf. They're the national numbering authorities, the government entities responsible for the numbering space. They give blocks of inventory to CSPs who are effectively acting as registrars. They're the people who have the business relationship with consumers, the customers of AT&T, the customers of Comcast, or whoever. Now, in some cases, you may have an enterprise who is the customer who's getting a set of numbers that they in turn delegate down to end users. And so in the most complicated models we look at, typically there's something that looks like roughly these 4 levels present in it. Is it possible for users to get numbers by going directly to a registrar? Sure, there's not, the enterprise here is contingent. The normal I get my cell phone from AT&T case is one in which that third box there goes away, right? But I think in this ontology, I kind of get better what a delegator is, what a registrar is, and what a registry is. Registries distribute numbers to registrars. If you have a direct relationship with the registrar, then you are not a delegate, right? If you have a direct relationship with the registrar and you are then giving numbers to someone else, you are a delegator, and those people, the users in this instance, are your delegates. Definitionally, I think this is much more crisp. This makes a lot more sense than what I had before. I think I can explain most of the use cases in this sense. People seeing this, does this seem sane? Or people looking at this and saying, I don't get this? Better than what I had before? Okay, I see some nodding. I don't see anybody getting up with to burn me in effigy. Next slide. Yeah, and just to articulate kind of what I said before, we do have this concept in the data types that there's a distinction between administrative data and service data. There are a couple of data types that you manage with this. And I imagine when we break this down, so there's now a registrar as a separate entity, we gain this useful distinction that we can say, okay, it may be one administrative entity performs both of these functions, but there are 2 discrete functions. They could be decoupled. One of them is that CSP function that manages the service data, knows about communication endpoints, knows about protocols, is what gets queried in real time. We need to route text messages or calls, totally get that. And they are providing a communication service, seems like a crisp definition. Those things fall all where they should there. And then you kind of have the registrar dimension of that manages the administrative data, knows who to bill, knows who is culpable if there is fraudulent or problematic activity going on. But these are logical roles that can be played by the same administrative entity. Having made this division, now I think I get it. It's clear to me. I think the ontology is about right. Next. So I had to kind of go through the use cases and amend them for this. And it does have some interesting edges on it to do so. We used to have use cases that talked about like a user acquiring a TN from the registry directly. A lot of people were barfing on that use case, and I get that. Now there is not a use case like that anymore. There are use cases where users get numbers directly from a registrar, and a registrar is often a CSP. And this looks an awful lot like the way that this just works out in the world today when you are getting a new cell phone number activated on Verizon's network. The cases where a user acquires a TN directly from a registrar who is not a CSP, those look, again, much more like those free phone cases where you go out and get this 800 number and now you can find a CSP to propagate it for you, but those have been decoupled. So in other words, all these abstractions exist in the telephone network today. This is no longer, in that sense, even forward-looking, right? This is actually descriptive rather than prescriptive of the administrative functions that are out there. But by characterizing them this way, I think we can enable some of the more experimental notions that motivated us to go down this path in the first place. Similarly, the management cases have to have that same distinction of usually to CSP, CSP to CSP, and so on, because they're broken down into those service data cases and those administrative data cases. When you're doing service data updates, usually you are going to be dealing with the actor doing the CSP role. When you're doing the more administrative things, typically you're going to be dealing with the registrar role. Maybe the same administrative entity, but from the flow perspective of what the protocols look like, we can break that down and decide how in the information model the messages then will be sorted for that particular use case. And at the end of the day, of course, what we really want to use all this for is to be able to, like, you know, route calls and have useful services on the internet and figure out who people are and what we're doing. So retrieval interface hasn't really changed that much because of the registrar thing. Really, the distinction between registry and registrar lives much more up in the acquisition and management protocols. But I think we have a much better notion now of how we get the data we want to get into these systems to let us do retrieval. Next slide. And I mean, so I went through all the use cases and basically just explained things like how the acquisition protocol looks for each of them when you put registrar into it. And it's pretty obvious, you know, if you're a CSP and you hold inventory, that seems to be something we commonly do in the telephone network today. You know, a Sprint will go to the NAMPA and say, I need some more numbering resources, and they'll get them. That might then be delegated down to someone else. You know, for those of you who came here because I asked you in STIR to come and attend this is also where credentials for these functions might be distributed. So I think this all works better with that registrar understanding. Next slide. And, you know, again, I've shown slides very similar to this before in this room. Really, I'm just taking the slides and saying I tweaked all the use cases to make sure that we got the registrar stuff into it. We still do want to enable functions like this, and I still hear interest in this from a certain set, especially of enterprise providers, and being able to figure out a way to get the acquisition protocol to work when a new phone gets spun up, say, and wants to be able to talk to an IPPBX and get assigned a new number. Next slide. And, you know, then even for cases like I have a new device and I want it to replace an old device, I want it to talk to the registrar and get provision with, again, credentials, whatever other administrative data needs to be assigned to do that, and whatever service data. There are all kinds of cases like this. You bought the new phone at the Apple Store and want to replace an existing account, where you see that user going up to the registrar/CSP, changing the service data and administrative data accordingly. Next slide. And this one, like I said, we're not doing it. It doesn't even make any sense in this model anymore, so it's out. Next slide. So yeah, now we're going to talk. Now we're going to talk a bit about what do we do. So I've just largely articulated what the changes are that I made based on our previous interim discussion. These are actually some pretty pictures. This is much more interesting what I'm talking about. That bridge out there is pretty nice. I'm not going to present the Terry work today. I did not increment the Terry work since last time. There are some things that I would probably tweak about the way that's structured, and I'll show you some slides about that in a minute. You know, I really would like to get some agreement on this problem statement here today, because honestly, I don't want to do any work on the Terry model unless I feel like there is a working group here that is going to like do something. And if we cannot get to the point where we think that the ontology that is in this problem statement is sufficient, then why should I bother to do any of this stuff? That much said, I think it does all work. I think it's a great time for STIR. I think STIR needs this stuff to get a lot of the credentialing systems that we're considering for that to actually work. Next slide. And you know, there will be questions, right? Like this is an example of something when I do Terry that when we've made the registry this thin, we're going to have some design decisions to make based on that model. Do we want the registry to contain pointers to CSPs so the user kind of, when he's doing retrieval, talks to the registry and then in turn talks to the CSP based on the pointer that they receive from the registry? You know, how do we want call routing to work and those things? There are things that we could do a couple different ways, and we can talk about that today if people want. That's not the main thing I want to talk about though. Those are the set of design decisions that open up to us to do the protocol work this working group is supposed to do, if in fact we are going to have a working group and do that work. Next slide, please. And that's just a Terry picture I put in to say, this is what I want to have. This is helpful. Like we can use this and it'll make happy things happen on the internet and it'll be so much better. Speaking as somebody whose company does a lot of like enormous stuff and works on a lot of those kinds of applications, having like an apps layer system that provided these qualities would be super useful. Next, and hopefully final slide. So we're gonna adopt this is right now, or I'm gonna drop the mic and I'm done. I'm serious. Like I am not gonna bring this working group Iraq for the next 3 years, making these like tiny incremental changes. I believe that what we have today is a sufficient start. I'm not saying it's ready for a last call. I think this ontology is a useful ontology. It solves actual real world problems, as well as aligning us with the future problems that the FCC workshop that, as we all know, inspired this, which was about what the future of numbering might look like. I think we've managed to create a framework, finally, that really casts that future in a way that is rooted in our administrative systems today. And I think I should have thought about this that way from the start, where really everything that I showed in this should have been traceable back to something that we do today at the start. That's on me. But now that's what we've got. And, if we're not going to do this, I suggest we all go find a better use of our time. So, I mean, I'd like to ask the chair, well, first of all, please discussion. If anybody has questions or wants to talk about the fate of the group beyond that, I mean, I'd like to ask the chairs to call this question because, they're bars open down there, right? And if we're done, we're done.
Well, before we call the question, I mean, how many people have read the updated draft? I think it's a very good draft, very good update, very clear, and is a good foundation for the architecture work item that we have on our working group list. But have people read the draft? Got 1 or 2, 3, 4, small number. I would encourage people to read it. It is a bigger change than I thought would be from the 03 version, but all good. That said, I'll unless we have any objections to calling the question here, and we'll do it again. Obviously, it has to, what we decide here, or what we recommend here, has to be decided on the list. So we'll take it to the list after. But yes.
Dan York channeling Peter Koch. At the risk of looking stupid or having Dan look stupid on my behalf, in the late stages of enum, we discussed a mapping of an E164 number and a service to a provider. That is, having different providers cover different services under the same number. The draft seems to speak of CSP as in a singular instance per number. Do you see any sense in broadening the proposal toward that late enum way?
Absolutely, Peter. I mean, I really do not think the intention, I believe there is a specific line in the problem statement that says that it is not an assumption of this work that a single CSP provides all the services associated with a particular telephone number. I can try to find that line. I'm pretty sure that line is in there.
And by the way, promoting this to a working group draft, those are the kind of questions that will get addressed on the list, and the draft will be updated based on the consensus we reached with the group. So we're not closing down those kind of conversations. It's a good question.
Okay, Peter says, okay, missed that, thanks. And then I'll add a few inches and I'll channel Henning Scholzreni and say, looks good to me as a starting point.
Chris went, I agree with the assessment that adding the registrar makes things a lot cleaner.
Any haters? Anybody who says this is misguided? You are going to hate. I know. That's fine. Look, I'm not seeing any haters.
No haters. So we'll let's go ahead and hum. We'll hum first if you are in support of making the problem statement a working group draft. Second, the second hum will be if you object to making the problem statement a working group draft. So first hum, are you in?
Chris Seal, I'm just a bit new to this, but I mean, this is a great description of the process, but is there a problem statement? But I haven't actually seen words saying this is the problem statement, or is that just am I being too literal? I
mean, I think they're in, it's not in this presentation. It's in the draft.
Yeah.
Yeah. I believe there is actually, well, I'm not sure there's literally like something that says the problem statement is, but yes, there's a block of introductory text in the document that articulates really what's in the introduction is what I consider to be the problem statement. It goes through and talks about what the changes are, the IP transition that everyone believes is going on, and kind of what is incumbent upon us to create a number management system that will work in an internet-based ecosystem when we get past the point where the PSTN is the primary place that telephone calls transpire. That is a summary, I guess, of what the problem was that instigated this. I think you'll find, again, 4 or 5 paragraphs that elucidate that in the introduction to the document.
It's, John, section 1 is called problem statement.
Oh, is it? Okay.
That's what I thought. Yeah. And the document is much more than just a problem statement. It's really an architecture document.
Right, like I said, I said at the beginning, it's kind of a grab bag. It's a problem statement. It's a framework that enumerates the actors' roles and data types, and it also is 16 or so use cases.
Right. Well, I'm giving people a chance to comment. Okay, so the hum. First hum, if you're in favor of this draft being promoted to working group document, please hum now. One more on chat. Any opposed?
We have chosen not to die, I would say.
We live on. Well, we'll take this to the list, and we actually did have a consensus in the room last time to make this a working group draft, and it got derailed on the list. But so we are still on life support, I think. But I think we'll make it. We'll make it through this time.
Let me know.
Yeah. So, Alyssa Cooper. If that doesn't work out, then we will shift into the conversation about what to do with this working group. So just to make that totally clear.
So we are on life support
closing
right
it.
now, yes, and the plug could still be pulled is the message.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Thanks, John.
Hi, I'm Tom McGarry. I put together, there's not a new draft. This isn't associated with a new draft. It's based on a draft, an informational draft that came out a couple of months ago. If you want to go to slide 2, I put this draft together because we're going through something in the US. There's this concept that they want to deploy what they're calling nationwide number portability. Our geographic numbers are tied to the PSTN to where the telephone number has a geography, right? If you're a New York number, you are connected to the PSTN in New York. Calls that go to and from you that go through the PSTN go through, ultimately connect to a switch in New York. The concept is they want to do away with that and have, if you're a New York number, you happen to live in Los Angeles, that the call does not have to go through New York to complete to you, that it can go directly to Los Angeles. So I put a draft. There was a concept that we came up with in the US to deploy this, which used a brand new non-geographic area code that would be used for routing numbers. And this area code would be hosted on IP switches. It would be all IP. Everything that went to this area code would be IP. In essence, what this does is it creates a IP parallel network to kind of the existing TDM network. And if people want to, carriers want to move their infrastructure over to the IP, they can do that. If they want to leave it on TDM, they can do that as well. And because this was an area code, all switches, even TDM switches, can route by area code. If they had someone routed, is on a TDM network, they originated a call to one of these numbers, they at least have enough smarts to get it to an IP network, like a partner of theirs who could complete the call on the IP network. So it's the idea has it allows the calls to be moved on the IP network to different geographies, and it allows the TDM networks to stay and do what they do today and not have to participate in this, just have to route to it. So anyhow, because this was a brand new numbering space, it was a greenfield numbering space, having been working on Modern for a little while, I thought it was a really good use case to start thinking about how would you do something like this. So I put together a draft that's just informational of a use case that said, here's kind of how we'd deploy this new numbering space in a modern context. So we have a brand new area code. It's used for routing numbers. So carriers acquire numbers to use for routing purposes. And we we can use these numbers to assign to consumers for regular voice and text messages. Today, we basically have only geographic numbers for those purposes in the US. We don't have non-geographic numbers for those purposes. Consumers just don't really get non-geographic numbers. Those are reserved for special services like toll-free and government services and things like that. So we'd have a modern registry that would manage the non-geographic routing numbers and non-geographic telephone numbers. I call the NGRNs the routing numbers, the regular telephone numbers, NGTNs. As I mentioned earlier, the routing numbers are hosted on IP switches. And this presentation goes into a little more discussion about how the actors in this ecosystem would work with each other a little more than the draft did. It also, by the way, assumes similar processes that we have today. So it's not as forward-looking as we like to think of in modern. It's a little more kind of near term. So it's based on that draft, the use case, and it's also based on the new version of modern problems. So you'll see lots of stuff talking about registrars and registries. Next slide, please. So what are registries, registrars, and assignees? We use the term assignees, by the way, in the draft, and that's probably something we should start thinking about. Maybe we should change the term to registrant, just to be more consistent with the domain name world, or the world that exists out there. So registries are authorized by a numbering authority to manage the numbering space. Again, they can be authoritative or distributed. By the way, it does not assume that communication service provider could not act as a registry. A lot of places, they don't allow that. But because we have this concept of distributed registries, why would we exclude carriers from being a registry? Registrars are authorized by the registry to acquire and manage the numbering resources. The communication service providers are likely to be registrars, as John mentioned earlier. And assignees are the ones that are acquiring the routing numbers and the telephone numbers. By the way, one thing I didn't mention is there's this concept, these IP switches that host the routing numbers in this kind of environment. We call them non-geographic gateways, just to have a nice four-letter acronym. So these non-geographic gateway providers are entities that would be looking for the routing numbers. So you have kind of two different types of users of the numbering space. You have the gateway providers, and you have the consumers, users. By the way, I also say, being that we're talking about distributed registries, registrars can connect to as many registries as they feel like. Assignees can have relationships with as many registrars as they feel like. This is the way the world works today. Why not? If you go to the next slide, please. So you're going to notice, by the way, so I talk here about how a gateway provider acquiring a routing number, what would be the process that they go through? I'm going to start analogizing in the coming slides this stuff to just kind of general modern concepts. I know this is kind of a nationwide number portability use case, but in reality, it works just the same for any kind of telephone numbers, geographic telephone numbers, and so forth. So on the left side, we start with a gateway provider looking to get a routing number. They presumably already have a relationship with the registrar. They have a credential that they can present to get authorized to ask for it. The registrar, who's likely a communication service provider. By the way, all of these could be one entity, right? The registry, the registrar, the CSP, and the gateway provider could all be the same entity. So the registrar authorizes the assignee, the gateway provider says, okay, you're allowed to ask for them. They could also, they authenticate them. They could also authorize them to say, yes, you're eligible to get one. Maybe there could be policies that you can only have so many. So that may be something that the registrar would have to check. So they review it, they approve it, they send up a request for the registry. By the way, one of the things that that we need to think about as we move forward in this is can they ask for a specific resource? Can they say, I want this number? Today in the US anyhow, when you're asking for a geographic number, they typically just get the next one. You don't necessarily ask for a specific one. Although certainly with a lot of VoIP providers, they allow you to scroll through and look for it.
We do exactly that with toll-free.
Yes.
You
yes,
can specify a specific number.
Yep.
You can get the inventory of what numbers are available.
Yep. Yeah.
Sorry, Brian Rosen.
Yeah, and I was thinking about, see, these numbers it's a network resource, being it's a routing number. It's not unlike a carrier code, and if you recall, in the old days, AT&T had a carrier code that was 288. They had 288 because it's spelled ATT. So yeah, why not have them request specific numbers? That gets more sticky, by the way, when you get into consumers asking for it, users asking for telephone numbers. So then you have to start thinking about speculation and squatting and all that. So the registry then reviews it and says, yeah, this person's able to get it. The registrar is able to get it. They again may need to authenticate and authorize. And they send down a response and say, yes, you've been assigned this, and the registrar CSP lets the gateway provider know that they have it. By the way, there's administrative data that goes up. There's service data. Where is the address for this? This is a gateway provider. They're going to need to understand what the address for that is. So the registry would want to keep that data. They also and by the way, this is again how the way it works in the U.S. They notify others that there's been a change in state, right? They could push down the information to the other registrars that are connected to it, and then those registrars could push down data that go to the communication service providers and the service enablers, and then they could put it in their local cache. If they need to. I have question marks there next to number 7 and number 8, because, we have this concept of a retrieval mechanism. Is this part of a retrieval? Does the registry simply notify people there's been a change of state? If you want information, come and get it. How does that work? Does the same apply between the registrar and the communication service providers and the service enablers? Don't know, but these are the kinds of things we want to think about.
Yeah.
Yes, John.
John Peterson. Yeah, I don't know. I would suspect that those would be management operations ultimately. And the question of kind of, is it a push, is it a pull? Those are actually really interesting questions in terms of what the semantics of the management interface needs to be. Yeah. If we imagine they're going to be kind of subscription style push interfaces or associated with that will let the registry get data down to the registrars, that's exactly the reason to have a document like this, right? Because this is the kind of thing that can say, okay, for this use case, we should make sure that we specify in the management interface that it should be able to do this.
Right.
Retrieval, again, I think has much more of the pull semantics, and moreover, I think it has much more of the semantics of individual users who are trying to either get administrative or service data, as a consumer of that, rather than provisioning other elements of the architecture, which is what I think you're doing here.
Right.
Chris went, that's might be why you want to consider a distributed registry. I was going to make another comment too about the routing number. Do we want to keep propagating routing numbers, or do we want more of a domain way of doing things?
It's a good question. I think not.
I think the only reason to do it would be for anonymity, and you can probably keep that, but
Well-
domains as well.
So the reason that the routing number is in this NNP solution in the US is to allow the TDM networks to play in the game, right? To allow nationwide number portability deployed without making mass changes to the TDM networks.
Brian Rosen. So we could reasonably call it a URI and allow a URN to be a URI and create things that would work for those environments.
Yes, yes. You know, and I'll tell you why I kind of thought about this push concept. You know, we are thinking about operationalizing this sometime, you know, within the next couple of years, right? This nationwide number portability thing. And the way carriers, I'm probably telling people here what they already know, the way carriers do IP routing, at least in the US, is they create these things called SIP trunk groups between their SBCs. And you have carrier A connects to carrier B, and they look at the first 6 digits of the telephone number and say, you know, when they're routing, they have a table that says these 6 digits go to this SIP trunk group, and they send it. We've rebuilt the PSTN the way it looks today. So something like this routing number, all you need to know, the only routing information you'd actually need to know is the number, the 10-digit number, and the service provider, the gateway provider that it goes to, because you will have a trunk group that goes to that gateway provider, and your table will look up 10 digits and come back with, it's this SIP trunk group that this goes to. So it's pretty simple stuff.
Chris went, well, it looks like a lot like telephone number at XYZ.
Yeah, well, no, and I agree with you. By the way, I don't think that's the long-term solution. Again, and what I think you would have though, you'd have I think there'd be other routing information in the service data, right? I think you'd have multiple things. You could have, because there are companies that route based on service provider IDs, just like a 4-digit number that's associated with a service provider, on the first 6 digits of the phone number, on the phone number itself, and maybe there's some that would actually want to on a URI. Right? So I think you could have when we think about what is the service data, you know, we'd think of, you know, it doesn't seem like a telephone number is actually service data. You would, you know, for us, you wouldn't think about that, but possibly that it's in there as well as a URI. So these are, you know, another couple of slides, I start saying, you know, these are the kinds of things that we should be thinking about. Thanks for the prompt. So if you go to the next slide, and I won't spend much time on this, but this is a comparison of how you would do, you know, I use the nationwide number portability use case, again, because I tend to think about these new things called a non-geographic routing number. But this could work exactly the same way for any kind of network resource. You know, numbering blocks are network resources. The carrier codes, as I mentioned before, are numbering resources. So you could have this same flow, you know, and as I point out, right, it's really the same flows, same questions we have. As you know, it helps me thinking through while I'm thinking about both modern and nationwide number portability. This stuff just works for the numbering resources that we have today and we're going to have in the future. Why don't you go to the next slide? And this is also, you'll notice here, as just to make the point once again, it works for the non-geographic resources the same way it works for geographic resources. Notice everywhere I have NG, I put it in brackets. This works the same for a non-geographic telephone number. It works the same for a telephone number, just regular geographic telephone number. So these are really kind of the same flows. The main difference here I've highlighted in red from the flows we just went through, and that is, you know, when you have a user, so this is a user asking for a telephone number, the registrar is going to collect contact information, kind of important administrative data. Their There's two models. The registrar could hold on to that information. That's what they do today. It could provide a reference address to the registry for important entities that have that are able to get contact information, like government entities. They could access it that way. But that's kind of I highlighted one of the main difference, but basically the flow is all the same from the assignee, the registrar, to the registry. This is kind of one of the differences that I think we'd see here. If you go to the next slide. So next steps and questions. I think we want to start thinking about the information model. I really covered the acquisition transactions here. In the problem statement, we have three types of transactions: acquisition, management, and retrieval. What is the administrative data? What is the service data? Actually, the discussions we were just having, I think we need to start getting to. Identify the options. There's the thin registry model where the registrar holds on to the contact data. There's the thick registry model where the registry holds on to that data. And then let's start talking about the retrieval processes, the places where I had the question marks in 7 and 8. What is that? Is it a management transaction, not a retrieval transaction? What do we, again, push-pull? Are entities maintaining local caches? Obviously, that would be one option. So just kind of questions that came up that I think, it's about time for moving forward on this to start thinking about these. If you go to the next slide, and I always seem to want to add a slide about the distributed registry because I like the concept. It's an important concept here. It's basically a very similar flow, as you can see. Up at flow 5, you start getting the registry having to deal with other registries to secure the number. It's telling them, hey, I'm looking for a number. Here's a number I'm looking for. Does anybody have it? If not, don't take it because I'm getting it for somebody. And then once that's done, then they can assign it to the user and then update the registry, and the other registries update the other registrars. I think you'd likely see all that right side be kind of collapsed, right? If we get to a point where we have these distributed registries, I think CSPs would be registries, they'd be registrars. The service enablers, companies that manage PBXs and so forth would also probably get into that type of role. So you'd see a lot of these things collapsing. But obviously, it's important to have what the flows are and what the data being passed between them is. Let's see. Did I have anything else? No, I think that covers it. And next slide. I think that's it. Yeah. So, any questions? Comments? Thanks for the feedback. I think that was exactly the type of discussion I wanted to have.
So the intent is not to advance this draft, right? This is just informational for the group to.
That's right.
To motivate the modern problem.
Yeah. What I think it can be used for is as we start thinking about what is the information model, right? That there's something called a telephone number, there's something called a geographic routing number, there's something called a non-geographic routing number, right? So we kind of understand those. So I think it's just informational for the group.
Yeah, John Peterson, it wouldn't be unheard of for an informational document like this to actually advance to be an RFC at some point if there's interest. I don't think we need to look at this as a dead-end exercise.
Yep. Okay. Yeah.
And that was kind of where my question was going, is whether maintaining this draft as we build modern infrastructure as a test case or as a making sure that we're touching all the necessary components, because it's a pretty complete problem definition for a specific use case, but it has all the pieces we need, I think.
I mean, I could see that, yeah, continuing to exist and becoming kind of not just here are the requirements, but here's how that is solved by the elements in Terry, but then at the conclusion of that process, it could indeed be an informational draft or whatever, right? Saying, look, this solves this problem.
Okay.
Alyssa Cooper. There's some discussion in the ISG about whether those kinds of drafts need to actually become published as RFCs. So this is not a question you need to think about today too much, but obviously useful to keep it around. But when the time comes, it may be the case that you say, this is great, glad we had it. But there's more machinery involved in getting an RFC number that might not add any utility. So.
Thanks, Tom. Next up is drip.
I'm gonna probably have a similar story about not doing too much work since the last. There hasn't been a lot of comments. I included some slides up front. More as still an overview. Actually, I presented these before, but I think if I'll only go through them quickly unless there's somebody here that wants me to go through them in more detail. But just from a high level, it's a HTTP-based protocol for sharing registries between distributed data stores. Pure HTTP uses gossip protocol and incorporates a voting mechanism to avoid conflicting data updates. Based on very well-known principles, well-known and highly implemented things in most of the databases that people use today. Also, I should note Henning during the interim meeting, I think pretty much gave an overview that very much aligns with this draft as well. So next slide. Just a picture of what this might look like, all interconnected via HTTP connections. Next slide. Contains basically two transactions, an update transaction and a sync transaction. One is when there's new information, it distributes it across all the distributed nodes. And the sync operation is either for a data store that is newly added to, or a node, I guess I call them, and a node is newly added to the distributed registry, or some error condition happened and it's missing things, so it needs to resynchronize its data. Next slide. There's both voting and commit phases. This is for highly reliable, just making sure there's no conflicts in the network, no race conditions, things like that. Next slide. And this is the overview from the draft that's there. Next slide. I mentioned this last time. There was some discussion on this, last time being in Japan. We took the approach so far that the scope of the spec was only for the protocol for exchanging data, and sort of took the approach of authentication and entitlement and other things could be put on top of this. Especially since it's HTTP based, there's a lot of mechanisms already out there, and there might be other use cases like security requirements for different scenarios. If I want to have a distributed registry internal to my network, I may have different requirements than what Modern is looking at. So we sort of wanted to keep that perspective, but that's up for discussion. Next page. So the main thing I'm here to say is we're still committed to updating and going forward, and even providing an open implementation. There's work related to this in ADIS in the spirit of the testbed initiative. So like I said, whether it's included in this draft or a separate draft, propose some sort of auth security framework. Also, number or identity porting security would be another aspect to think about as well. either in this draft or a separate one. And also, I think whether it's Terry or whatever, the data model may impact some of this stuff, but hopefully it's pretty independent. Or it may impact actually the security model and the other things. So,
John Peterson, I sure hope it does. Right.
Right.
So, I mean, I just think we need to, when we've gotten this to the point, almost like the nationwide number portability use case, this is kind of a use case for the information model, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
it's also a protocol specification, but we want to make sure that the way that we talk about these elements of the information model has all the hooks that are required, that people using the retrieval interface that might not even be aware that it is a distributed registry behind this are going to get sensible information that's going to work for them and so on. So, I mean, there is a reconciliation to be done when we start doing the actual protocol work on Terry here to figure that out. And, but I think that is just work, and we'll do it when that is the time to do it.
Right. Any other comments? So right now, this is a independent draft. I don't know. I think there is a couple missing components in there in its current state. I will update that for the next meeting. But happy to just keep it as an independent draft, or that's up to how we feel. If this is becoming part of what we want to do in Modern, I'm happy to promote it there too.
And that was going to be the conversation I wanted to have next, is whether, I mean, it's clear from the discussions we're having that DRIP or something like DRIP is needed and would add a lot of value for the distributed registry problem. The question is whether this group has the right people in it to do protocol specification for that kind of a problem, or whether it would make more sense to dispatch that work separately, or I don't know, do a survey of capabilities that exist already to see if there's something that fits. And I don't have an answer to that question. I'm just asking the question. I don't have necessarily a strong opinion one way or the other, but I am afraid that this group doesn't have the expertise on distributed data management, has an expertise on numbering, and so it might not be the right place to do this. I don't know. Do other people have opinions on that?
Brian Rosen, gee, I think I can do this, but maybe there isn't enough. I kind of thought we could do it, and whether we should adopt it now or wait until we're a little bit farther along is kind of doesn't matter to me much. But I was kind of hoping we could do this here and not have to go somewhere else to do it.
Yeah, John Peterson, Brian, weren't you in that peer-to-peer SIP?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like we haven't looked at some of these structures, in the past. I do actually think in maybe not the numbering community, but the community that has designed the protocols that we are evolving into. This has been a subject, I think, of actually quite detailed study already here in the IETF. And it might even get some different people in the room, who have that expertise if they understood that this was something we were going to take a serious crack at. So, I mean, I'd love to see it here.
And then the question, it really doesn't fit on the charter that we have today. Or maybe it might be a bit of a squint to have it in the charter. I don't know if we need to worry about that now. I'm probably asking the question too soon, but.
Alyssa Cooper. I'll squint at it some more. I think there's an argument to be made that it fits. I mean, you need a milestone for it, but yeah, I think it's totally workable. And the other thing is that actually P2P SIP is winding right down, but there's a lot of academics there and stuff. So it's just a matter of letting them know that this is going on, and I bet you'll get some people take a look at it. So.
Okay, good point. Yeah, we'll have to add a milestone. That's much easier than charter changes.
Dan York, I don't see any issue with doing that in here. I mean, but I guess I would just say, to John's point, there are lots of other places within the IETF where distributed databases are dealt with. I mean, I guess, the whole DNS area and other spaces where there's large places like that. I guess the question is, how do you alert some of those folks that this is going on? And so I would suggest that if this is dealt with here, there should be some conscious outreach to some of those other communities within the IETF who are doing this to let them know that it's happening here within this area.
Good point. And I think at a minimum, having a strong set of requirements is a very valuable thing, that we are the ones that should write that part of it for sure. So that, yeah.
John Peterson, just to reiterate my earlier point, the Terry data model needs to actually work with whatever this is going to be. Even if we think DRIP needs to design somewhere else, we need the requirements of that system to properly implement the information model that we want to do here. So,
Anything else on DRIP?
Good.
Okay, thanks. So our only remaining item was to talk about the work plan for advancing work. I think I had a slide here, that showed the original milestones. Oh yeah. Okay, so our original milestones, we're supposed to have the architecture document submitted to the ISG as we speak. So we're behind, but I think I'm hoping we can accelerate things now that once we get past the do or die, final do or die decision. First question, next item is Terry, and John's walking up to the mic to talk about that. Before you do, let me ask the question of whether, John, you think it would be worthwhile to have an interim on Terry specifically between now and Berlin?
Sure, John. Provided again that there's no sudden surprises on the mailing list in that regard, I wouldn't mind it. I mean, I remember when we first looked at these milestones, I kind of said things along the lines of doing the information model work. The incremental adapters for TN resolution or whatever that follow on that are actually quite small and quite simple. And just kind of looking at the way this charter is structured, I'm sure I recall commenting on this at the time. It would not be unreasonable for that to be literally bundled, right? I mean, to do the TN resolution bundled with the information model. Because of the fact that you basically need to have solved all of the problems about how to do TN resolution to be confident that we could submit the information model to the ISG. Looking at these numbers now, I kind of barf a little, but and again, because we're looking at DRIP and because we're looking at nationwide reportability, and we see those as use cases that potentially impact that information model, I think that milestone is too aggressive. But so the silver lining I'd say on that is that it will collapse in with, I think, the things that follow on very short order once it's complete.
Yeah, I'm not trying to get the work done before it's ready.
Yeah. I'm just saying if we're looking at this from a perspective of where do we think we are with these and what do we actually think we'll be doing at this point, I think that July date is not reasonable at this point.
Oh, no, I wouldn't, I didn't want to suggest that. I was just, the discussion is hopefully to start getting more cycles and accelerate the process on the other documents, since we lost so much time on the architecture draft or the problem statement. And I think we should be able to do that, because hopefully we've addressed a lot of the concerns about the problem statement, and we can get to real focused work now, I'm hoping, but.
Yep, but like I said, I mean, there were a lot of open questions today about whether the management interface or retrieval interface slotted into particular places in NNP. I have a lot of questions about how management interface would work with DRIP. And so, I mean, just to bear in mind, I think we're going to have to get some better maturity for the specific use cases we want to go after for this. Another use, I mean, the tacit use case that weighs most heavily on me isn't really even either of those. It's enrollment data stuff for STAR, right? And of things that I actually feel like a burning urge personally to solve, that's one of the big ones. And so, yeah, I don't know. Yes, so let me actually answer your question. Yes, an interim would probably be helpful for us to talk about Terry, to talk about where we are with all this and what we think the core inputs to it are. I'd be happy to do some work in advance of that. Again, provided that the consensus of the group is that we're going to proceed.
Yes, it's all contingent on that, of course. I just didn't want, I wanted to make sure we'd have enough enough to actually talk about at the interim. And I think we probably already do in the existing Terry draft. We've talked about it a little bit, but now we need to start putting more meat on the bones to based on the real use cases. So, okay, well, we'll take it offline on whether we can coordinate that between now and Berlin. Was there anything else, Todd? Chris?
Maybe just one comment to answer John's question about drip and management interface. There's definitely a abstraction layer there. It's basically you store data in some object, and the interface to that is abstract from that. Similar to a file system versus a, application. So.
Totally agree, Chris. I had a slide up that showed what, consequent to our decision to introduce registrars into this, a thin registry might look like in terms of even an end user for retrieval consulting a thin registry, and what kind of pointer might or might not live there, and how that would connect you to, in this case, would be to probably either another registry or a, I think those are the kinds of things we need to articulate what those things mean for what the core data is that we imagine is going to live in these objects. And once we understand that better, then I think I'll be much more comfortable about getting the information model into shape to advance.
Anything else modern-wise that anybody needs to talk about, wants to talk about? Well, then we'll finish early. Thanks, everybody. Where's the blue sheet?
Oh, really?
Thanks. I don't think so.